Hi, welcome back to Laser Focus. I am your host, Lazar Berman. Now, we've had 5 weeks of wartime episodes, and I'm going to be honest with you, I don't know if this is another wartime episode. It's definitely a ceasefire episode. Actually, I'm not even entirely sure about that because we're recording this on Thursday, and by the time it comes out on Friday, we might be back in a wartime episode. So there's a lot of things that are not known, and there are a lot of questions, a lot of arguments. Arguments around, was the war worth it? Was it a victory? What did it achieve? Did it strengthen Iran? Did it weaken Iran? Where do we go from here? Who better to talk about this than an old friend of the show, an old friend of the Daily Briefing as well, John Spencer, one of the preeminent experts in urban warfare and warfare in general in the United States. John, good to see you again.
Hey, Laser, it's great to see you.
So before we get into a conversation, we are going to take a quick break, and then we'll be back with John to talk about the war in Iran, what happened, and where we go from here. And we're back. So I just want to start with kind of taking stock of the claims of what were accomplished, and then we can talk about what does this add up to. So you had Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Raisin Kane, who Trump likes to talk about, seems to like this guy, but he kind of listed what has been achieved by the U.S. 80% of Iran's air defense system gone, 450 ballistic missile storage facilities, 800 one-way attack drone storage facilities, 90% of the Iranian Navy gone, 95% of naval mines, 90% of weapons factories. So that is the American military assessment of what has been accomplished. We also heard Prime Minister Netanyahu last night in his attempt to color the way this war is being will be seen as saying that Israel pushed off the ballistic missile threat, the nuclear threat, and now Israel is stronger than ever. Iran is weaker than ever. And we also had White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt say explicitly that this was a victory for the United States. When you assess the entirety of this 39 days of fighting, does victory come into the conversation for you? How are you seeing the results of this war at this point when we're in the beginning of this ceasefire phase?
Yeah, and there's a lot there. I almost, I find myself a lot on social media, like Mel Gibson from Braveheart, just saying, hold, because you just can't
My
make an
favorite movie, by the
assessment.
way.
Yeah, yeah. You can't make an assessment at this moment. We can, which I think would be important to tally what is should be observable facts, right? In my research, in God I trust, all others bring data. You listed what the Joint Chief of Staff, General Kane, listed. The CENTCOM commander, Admiral Cooper, this morning said a generational military victory. Uh, but these are achievements. Even though what General Kane listed, and I would love your opinion, isn't the whole picture. It's a unique aspect of needing not talking points, but needing consumable information and measures, right? But where if you were to look at each of the individual programs, which I would assess the war, right? Victory or not cannot be assessed, just period. As soon as we start talking victory, in my opinion, then you have if. You have to add a lot of ifs in there. If, the Straits of Hormuz are opened, if the nuclear program ends, if this or that. But in the progress of the war, I would assess it against, and I would love your opinion about the clarity in Israel's government positions since the beginning on February 28th, what the goals were. I've been on a lot of shows having to clarify almost the insanity, the surreal reality that no matter how many times the president of the United States, the Secretary of War, who Department of State says, here are the four goals of the war, and that's what we will measure success. And then there'll be a lot of more discussed, especially in interview questions and everything. And I know you do a lot of interviews, but if the four goals, and sometimes the words change, which does matter, since February 28th, were to destroy the missile supply in industrial base, to destroy the Navy, to prevent Iran from obtaining a nuclear weapon, and to ensure that the proxy program does not continue. Like depending on what day it was, the 4 goals were might interchange destroy to eliminate or ensure to another word, and those sometimes matter for assessment, but if we look at the 4 goals, of course, missiles are easy to talk about, right? So, those numbers of how much of the missile supply, how much did they have before, you've covered, of course, in the 12-day war, what were the estimates, and these are all, of course, open source estimates versus what has been done in this 30 plus days. I would broaden the conversation like, okay, if we're going to talk missile, Navy, Air Force, uh, proxy program, nuclear program, then let's be honest with even Israel listing all of the sites that it hit during the war that are parts of the program, right? The parts of the missile program, like the manufacturing base, the where you get your rocket fuel, where you get the steel to make a rocket, things like that, that I would assess, of course, and this is where people are like, okay, yeah, fine, tactical victory, not a strategic victory. I mean, there's nobody who could argue that Israel and the United States have not achieved a resounding military victory over the Iranian military. Of course, war is the pursuit of political goals, right? So this would go into even the assessment, which I didn't even mention, of the complete elimination of the existing political and military leadership, which does matter in war. I don't care what people say about, decapitation strikes don't work. You can't argue if you put up the diagrams and the wire diagram charts of what the Israel mostly, but the Israel and the United States have done to eliminate political and military leaders, which again hold and see what that the output of that is. What is the result of those eliminations? Is it for the good or for the worse? But you can't say that the United States and Israel haven't been historically effective at that strategic level, because if you talk strategic leaders, then these are, of course, strategic goals to eliminate at least their thinking about the problem set. And we could argue, well, will that lead to a change, which is the wait and see? At this very moment that we're talking, everybody is jumping to victory or defeat. And I don't speak for anybody in the administration. You know this. I do war, but I don't do politics, which is its own oxymoron. But anybody who's saying victory or defeat at this moment is doing it for a reason. Even if you were to say for some reason that it all comes down to the Straits of Hormuz and the nuclear program. Okay, well, that's not true and against the 4 goals, but let's go there. We don't know. We don't know behind the scenes why the a certain military or force was put in different military locations. I wrote this article that did very well, listing very common sense options the United States and Israel could take, and they didn't. And everybody says, well, they didn't because they can't, like opening the straits. Well, they didn't open it because they can't. That's not a true statement. And if the U.S. military and Israel, especially combined, want to do something, they've shown whether it's to go get a downed pilot deep in enemy territory, or to whatever it is, the nuclear program to hit at a depth nobody thought was possible. All these things, they can, but there's a reason that they aren't. Whether it's a geopolitical, economic reason, whether it's a who you're dealing with now, the talks that are happening behind the scenes, and lastly, I know that's a a long answer for a very short question in the beginning, is we don't even know who is the decision makers in Iran at this moment. Who are the people negotiating? As you know, the foreign minister is saying one thing, the president's saying another, IRGC public statements are saying another. Then there's this whole 10-point plan, 5-point plan, 15-point plan thing. We just don't know. And I come with a bit of, as you do, experience and humble pie on going, we don't know.
So what I think concerns me is I'm looking from the Israeli side, and after October 7th, right, the worst slaughter of Jews since the Holocaust, Netanyahu says, "Okay, we've changed total victory." And I look at Gaza and I say, "Well, Israel has done a ton in terms of eliminating leadership, taking away capabilities. Israel was able to go where they wanted in Gaza. And what did it add up to right now? Well, Hamas still has their weapons. They still control almost every single Gazan. And we have this plan in place, which, if implemented, would equal victory. But Hamas, even last week said, we're not going to give up our weapons. I look at the north. I go to Lebanon, and I was astounded by the 2024 operation, how well it went, how what Hezbollah agreed to in the 2024 ceasefire. And there's an anti-Hezbollah government in place. And then what does it come down to? Hezbollah rebuilds and is making the north almost unlivable again. And now I look at Iran, and to me, I see a pattern here that Israel, or maybe it's just this government, knows how to start a war very well, knows how to achieve unthinkable things, unprecedented things. I think so impressive that it's almost expected now of Israel to be able to hit any enemy leader wherever it wants. And in the end, it gets to these US backed or sometimes US imposed ceasefires that turn into just this long reality. And then we have more promises that Israel will go back to war that if it needs to, and it never does. So that's kind of the mood I'm in right now. That's what I wrote yesterday. And I think that reflects a lot of Israeli thinking right now. Is with all of this tactical excellence and operations that everyone agrees must happen. I don't think many Israelis are saying, why did we go to war in Iran? But is Israel and now Israel and the US? We'll see. But it seems like if this pattern holds up in Iran, why do we have another case where we get stuck in this kind of ceasefire before everything is achieved on the ground and ultimately the seeds of the next war are planted? That's how I see it.
And I definitely see why a lot of people would look at that view. I of course am an outsider, so I'm assessing each individual operation against the goal stated at the beginning of the operation, whether that's in Gaza to destroy Hamas's military, to return all the hostages, and remove Hamas from power, the temporary ceasefire with a progressive plan, and a lot of people skeptical on what that happened. Hamas of October 6th is not the Hamas of today. You're right. The control is still there. Some arms are still there, but they've been cut off from ever being resupplied. Lebanon equally. The deterrence factor, the capability factor, of course, the idea that the goal was never to destroy Hezbollah at that point, and what it would take. Same thing with Iran, the capabilities that Iran had before. This isn't mowing the grass per se. These are strategic paradigm shifts, in my opinion, that nobody could have imagined before October 6th. So I look at it as one is that this ideal that the history of war, you can have this certainty and finality and what happens. You're right on the Israel never being allowed to win a war in its history. Somebody steps in and says, for all these reasons, we're saying you have to stop. That's a historical fact that of course, you could argue as well, and that's not right. But ultimately, each one of those campaigns you discuss will be assessed upon the end result. None of them were actually declared over. Not the Gaza war with the supposed peace plan, not the agreement between Lebanon and Israel, and the movement that was done from the Lebanese government and military on Hezbollah. Of course, never, not enough, complex, and then the same thing with Iran. Um, on a slightly different view, if you were to ask me, Laser, is Israel safer today than it was on October 6th? Just from anybody's ability to wage war, whether it's a proxy army, a terrorist state, is a combination of their means and will. From that perspective, I would debate, and if you want to, we can, that Israel is much stronger today than it was on October 6th. Iran is much weaker. The Ring of Fire, all of the strength of its proxies, its allies who didn't show up for it versus Israel's allies. Well, of course, we can talk about the court of public opinion, but those who actually joined Israel in defending Israel, Arab nations to the United States doing an historic, never before joint operation like this, side by side, Israel demonstrating to the entire Middle East that it is essentially a military superpower in the region by being able to provide almost the exact same capabilities. Of course, there's some that they just don't have and they haven't pursued with the United States. I just don't get I absolutely, for me, I take a wait and see on all of different engagements. I also go back to October 6th, whether it's the rocket diplomacy where anybody can shoot a rocket at Israel and They pretty much got to take it. That's gone. And again, the ability for, like you said, to kill leaders, and what that means on, well, then we're just going to destroy you. And they don't have that capability. That doesn't mean they're not going to continue it. But even if we just look at Iran today, it does not have the capabilities that it did, the means to wage war against Israel, very specifically, nor does, we could argue, well, does it have the will to do it anymore? And this is the, we, as of what we're talking, people are already jumping to the end before even the dust of a single bomb cloud settles. We don't know what's going to happen with the deal. What are the terms of the deal? And we don't know. And I would argue strongly, we don't know what's going to happen to the regime. I've argued strongly, you didn't ask me, that this was not a regime change war. I don't know if you think for Israel's government it was, but the United States, I mean, President Trump had to make it crystal clear. This is, I never said this was a regime change war. It is not. And yes, they could come to, if they agree to these terms, the same, theocracy, Islamic regime, saying all the things that they want to say, can still will still be in power, but that doesn't mean the goals weren't achieved.
Yeah, so I think on the Israeli side, in terms of regime change, you could tell that Netanyahu is smart enough not to say it. But without saying it, he did everything he could to indicate that this is what Israel wants. And especially in the first half, he talked about creating the conditions. And he even said to the Iranian people, we are going, get ready because pretty soon is going to be your time. But that time never came. He promised he would send a sign. Uh, so it seems like
Yet,
there was some much more hope on the Israeli side that this would end differently in terms of the Iranians or maybe even the Kurdish groups rising up.
so I would just add yet, because then we go through the assessment of what did Israel do, right? So you said these statements, which I agree with you. They said them. The United States said it in the first speech. It was after the goals were stated, after he told the IRGC to basically to just lay down their weapons. He said, the United States did, that this is your generational chance. Wait, and all of this. It is actually, if you look at what Israel was doing specifically versus the United States, who was destroying military means and will as to do things, to be able to do things, Israel was attacking all of those levers that the regime would ever use to oppress the population and to survive. So you can't say that Israel said these. I wouldn't say that Israel said these things to the population and didn't follow through with that, attacking all of the besieged headquarters, the police headquarters, the besieged checkpoints, the financial means of the regime to oppress the population. And that's the wait and see part of this. I would argue, even from that, which was not one of the listed goals for the United States, but to say that Israel and the United States haven't set the conditions to give the Iranian population a once in a lifetime chance to, if they, and then we could argue, well, they can't. They killed tens of thousands of the ones that were involved in the January 2026. All can be argued, but I would argue from an assessment perspective, and I'm not inferring, but just from as objective as I can, did the United States and Israel set the conditions to make the regime weaker in even its ability to oppress the population? Yes, in my opinion.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Well, let me take a step back. Let's look at the actual campaign. Is there anything that you realize now that you understand now about either the IDF or the U.S. military after observing almost 6 weeks of them fighting together that you didn't know before in terms of capabilities, in terms of approach, in terms of their potential when they fight together?
I mean, I think no, because you and I have been studying this for a while, and I've seen I mean, even some people put it at when Israel was put under U.S. Central Command, coming out of European Command. There's absolutely fundamental changes. But being a former military guy, the military to military relationship between Israel and the United States, massive. Um, but I would say understanding the ability to do an operation like this from a more of a military analysis, the synchronization between U.S. and Israeli forces to be doing, even in the opening moment, you have Israeli aircraft in the sky with tomahawks in flight, all of it synchronized in time and space to have this massive, never before in the history of war effect on an enemy nation. That was surprising because of understanding how much integration has to have, no longer, different rooms or anything and commanders working with each other daily. That aspect that I mean, I shouldn't be surprised, but you have to be surprised at Israel's intelligence penetration of an enemy forces, and their ability, whether it's to tap into highway cameras to track the supreme leader or whatever it is. There's that little bit of that surprise. The I know the difference between air superiority and you're basically being able to do your mission over an enemy nation without interference, but still have a lot of risk versus air supremacy. So the ability, which I shouldn't have been after the 12-day war, but I was, I mean, because I understand even during the 12-day war, Israel could create corridors of air superiority to do a mission and get out versus what was essentially, for the United States, 13,000 combat sorties or flights. And with you had Israel, it's probably over 15,000. And not to have only to have two aircraft down by enemy fire that's surprising, really, from a military history perspective. These things seem easy, and I also don't want people to think that that's the future of all warfare because the idea that you could do an operation of this scale with no cost to human life, which there was, of course, cost to human life, but people will have this idea of a bloodless, perfect war when that's just even in a strategy. If you would say, okay, what was the plan going into this? I can tell you what the goals were. I can tell you what I believe many of the plans are based on what the strikes were, right? The attacks on Iran's different centers of gravity. But war is not a checklist plan that you start on day one and implement. The enemy always gets a vote. So I'm surprised, of course, by the dominance of Israel and the United States working side by side in straight parity of capability to where you're dividing up targets across the nation but also dividing up efforts, whether it's the regime's ability to maintain power and to threaten it versus the its ability to project power outside of its borders. If you were to ask me, Laser, which I hope you don't mind me answering, what am I surprised on the Iranian side? So the I if I have actually from my own military career have war gamed different scenarios in Iran, like Bandar Abbas and the Strait of Hormuz, and just in my own professional military training, and the ideal that the United States military, and I'm sure to go to same for Israel, didn't plan for things like the Strait of Hormuz being
I was that
threatened.
was gonna be my next question. Do you buy into that narrative?
No, absolutely not. It's just ignorance. It really is. If you not to offend any guests you might have, but if somebody says that the U.S. military with Israel planning side by side, I mean the U.S. military, like I said, I mean this is over. Oof, I'm starting to date myself. 15 years ago, regularly planning scenarios involving the Strait of Hormuz. But there's entire task force in the U.S. Navy and in the Pentagon whose sole job is that scenario in the Strait of Hormuz. The idea that we didn't have plans, we didn't believe that they would do it. I think it's just fantasy. I mean, it's ridiculous. Of course, the enemy gets a vote on when it's executed, and then everybody wants to discount all the other decision-making factors, right? The what we call decision points of when the United States and Israel saying, okay, do we shift efforts to that being the focus or based on the impact of the global market for the United States, which is really important, and other factors. Absolutely not. But Iran surprised me in attacking 14 different nations, not just the Gulf states, but attacking Turkey, Azerbaijan, Cyprus.
Cyprus.
I mean,
Yeah.
yeah, I get the kind of the chaos strategy of creating that geopolitical crisis in especially in media and within allies saying, "You should just stop." It's almost like they took an Israeli approach to the United States, right? So they took this approach of, if we force enough international condemnation and that this is going to escalate and spiral out of control, United States would be forced to stop. That's even in the Gaza scenario that we've talked to. Yeah, the United States would have fought it differently because the United States can fight it differently. We would have put a lot of pressure on Egypt to open up its to create a humanitarian area for the civilian population, so Hamas couldn't use that as its sole primary weapon, the human sacrifice, and other things. But I was surprised that Iran continued to attack all of its allies, which I think will lead to the strategic effect of bringing Arab countries that were trying to get closer to Iran, away from Iran, closer to Israel and the United States. I mean, of course, there's the financial bit of the UAE recertifying their $1.4 trillion deal with the United States, Qatar, their $1.2 trillion deal. Like all of those are now ironclad. And we'll see what the strategic effect of this strategy of Iran attacking everybody simultaneously and not just military locations where U.S. forces were or were not stationed, but civilian sites, energy infrastructure. It's like it's almost the bar. I really think John Stewart called it right. Like the worst. I've been in a few bar fights myself, but the worst strategy if you're fighting a really big guy is just start slapping everybody around you, to asking them to hit you as well as the big guy to hit you. It strategically, it's just I understand like kind of the small strategy aspect of that which failed. It did not stop. It actually just increased the operation, increased the destruction of their means, and validated laser Iran's strategy, which I find surprising, validated the rationale for the necessity of the operation. The longer ranging missile Diego Garcia, these things that they said they didn't have, the Navy threat, using its threats, not capability, but threats to the Strait of Hormuz to close it. Iran has validated, in my opinion, the necessity of doing the operation, that the ideal that Iran, which is what if I don't believe personally, and I can be wrong because I'm now guessing I think it is highly unlikely that Iran ends with control over a international shipping lane, uh, not a toll system, nothing, because it just would be historically strategic defeat. If not, you could argue the United States has said, it's not ours, we don't care about it. Absolutely matters. But it validated by doing it the necessity of the operation because no matter how much the world was shown how Iran was a threat to not just Israel, its neighbors, Europe, and the United States, Iran has now validated that position and intelligence, saying that they were indeed the threat to stability in the region.
So let me give I guess a devil's advocate to that because I think Iran thinks, oh
Yep.
sure, they think that their strategy worked, right? They'll say, we had this plan to raise the cost for everybody. We did it. We weren't afraid to do it. We suffered somewhat, but guess what? We're still in power. The Israelis had to stop. Trump is talking to us directly. We might get, we think, Iranians think we might get some sort of cash cow, through the Strait of Hormuz, which will let us rebuild. So the strategy was exactly what we needed. It guaranteed our survival, which is our victory. Does that? Do you think that there's anything to that claim at all?
I think it is a fault. I understand that people will say it. People will say that in order for Iran to win the war, all it had to do was survive. That only, from a critical thinking perspective, that only holds water if anybody said that their strategic goal was the regime change of the Islamic regime in Iran. So for me, that then we get into the capabilities of Iran. And do you truly believe that it was destroyed, eliminated, set back, all of these things, which everybody says that's tactical, that's not strategic? No, Iran cannot claim that it achieved a victory by surviving the war. One, because it's not the same people. So who survived? The regime. Okay, the form of government survived. Maybe. We'll see. But that wasn't like I just wouldn't do that in any other war, Laser, and I really try as I study, whether it's the Nagorno-Karabakh war that I'm currently just finished a book on, Indo-Pakistan 4-day war. We would not use that framework of, well, they survived it, unless, like Hamas, you said you were going to remove them from power. Then you could say, okay, you did
Yeah.
not achieve that goal for now, although there is a plan that they signed, supposedly signed an agreement to give up power to this other force. I don't think that holds water. The whole capabilities part, more importantly, same thing with Hezbollah, right? Nobody said they were going to destroy Hezbollah. It was about their means to wage war, to threaten northern Israel, all these elements. And if you think that if you're an outsider, so that's kind of answering those advocating that Iran achieved a strategic goal by survival. Now, eventually we could say, well, did they did they get this new control over the Strait of Hormuz? That is a question to be answered, and I just think it's unlikely, but I could be proven wrong, and then you could say, yes, they achieved this strategic, um, victory in that perspective. I don't know for the whole set of the war, again, going to the goals of both sides, who achieved their strategic goals. One side didn't say that they wanted the regime to change, we wanted regime behavior change, capabilities to do all this. And then we could try to get honest. And this is why we teach a whole class when I taught strategy at West Point is how, what defines victory, right? The achievement of the strategic goals in a campaign. And it isn't easy and it isn't clear cut as people want it to. But we live in this information space where people will grab the data they want to support what they want, their opinion. And I'm just trying to do, and I know you do as well, is you can have you can take a contrarian view, but is there enough evidence to support that at the moment or eventually?
So we're going to talk about what might happen next, but first we'll take another break. And we are back with John Spencer. So it seems like on Saturday we're going to start having talks in Pakistan led by Vice President J.D. Vance with Iran's Speaker of Parliament, obviously a hardline guy, an IRGC guy himself. Now, Iran has released their set of 10 demands. There's been different versions, but it seems like everything on the list is a non-starter for the U.S. A non-aggression pact. Iran demands that they would maintain some sort of control over the Strait of Hormuz, like you talked about. The ending of the regional war on all fronts. So that would include Israel's ability to weaken Hezbollah and keep them from rebuilding themselves. How about this one? Withdrawal of U.S. combat forces from all bases in the region. Okay, that's not going to happen. Reparations they want. Acceptance of Iran's right to nuclear enrichment, lifting of all primary, secondary sanctions on Iran, termination of all resolutions from the UN and from the IAEA. I don't see a single one that America could accept. And then Trump has his 15 points. Let's even forget about the Pakistani 5 points. Is there any chance in your mind that the two will be able to find something that's workable?
Absolutely, there's a chance. Again, going back to who's saying what on the Iranian side, people taking interviews on our side, although I think there's more clarity on the U.S. kind of what we will agree to, what we won't, but it is a negotiation. There's always, um, you try to get closer. It's not comparable, and I hate false analogies, but we heard from many of these same people saying that Hamas would never give up all the hostages, but they did.
True.
And so just as a very recent example of those that say never, I say never. The things that I will be looking for, of course, again, going back to the Hezbollah, people will say, but you said they were destroyed. No, actually, nobody said. And anybody who has any bit of information on the situation of Hezbollah, even after Israel's historic, from the pager operation to the leadership elimination and rocket supply degradation, that they were destroyed. Nobody thought that. There was supposed to be this other operation and wait and see. But for me, from the deal, um, one side has a maximus, both sides have a maximus position, right? I think one side, the United States and Israel, has more leverage, but the other side does have interests beyond survival, which I think, again, I strongly believe the United States, at least the United States, and only speaking from my own opinion, is willing to let the regime survive as long as it the certain terms that we view as critical are met. And I would be looking specifically as the time unfolds, the status of the nuclear program to include the fissile material, right? The 1,000 pounds, I don't do kilos, almost 1,000 pounds of 60% enriched uranium, the Strait of Hormuz ultimate status, no toll booth, um, no Iranian control outside of their own territorial waters or force of control or threat of control. And then I would be looking at the money situation as well, because um, Iran wasn't strong before this war. As you know, the regime close to falling economically through its own devices, its own decisions, and it spent your listeners will know, but most people don't know that it sent $1 billion to Hezbollah in 2025. That was $1
Right,
billion
when they
dollars.
couldn't provide water or
Yeah,
electricity to their own people.
that's right. They were literally, and this isn't John Spencer's plans. The Islamic regime in Iran was making plans to move Tehran, the capital of the nation, to a different site because they couldn't bring water. Um, so the regime wasn't strong before. So this ideal, and there's this. I really try not to attack people. I attack veracity of claims. The ideal that Iran comes out of this as a superpower, much stronger. It's just mental home insanity, to be frank. The regime was not strong before this, but it had immense capabilities, right? Just like Hezbollah, immense capabilities. But for Iran, it was not strong as a government functioning, right? So it will need cash flow to survive. So I believe that's one of the levers that the United States and others will be able to say, like, you want to survive. Like that's always the goal, even of a terrorist regime that does actually has some irrationality into it, but is a rational actor. They want to survive, and they will make decisions like, well, we still want to destroy you later, but for now, we want to survive, and we need a lot of money to recover from this war. And that's the fantasy of reparations, but I think they're the sanctions relief and other elements of yes, if you agree to these terms that the nuclear, the strait, the ending of the long range missile program, all of these elements, then you could see sanctions relief and not economic assistance. That is ultimately, which I don't personally want, right? I want the people of Iran to be free. And I imagine personally the power of the Persian culture, the Iranian people once free of this oppressive regime, as much so as I do in other areas. But they're playing the strategy to survive, which will require face saving, of course. They're going to say a bunch of stuff, but that's where, again, don't listen to what they say, listen to what they do. What happens with the nuclear, the strait, and their other programs that are tied, but they're going to want money to survive. And that's that actual leverage that the United States brings. It's not like the United States doesn't have anything at the negotiation table, right? Not that all, we had to dissuade people this of the, just with dealing with Hamas and others, not all war ends at a negotiation table. I mean, sometimes it ends at a surrender table, unilateral surrender. These are the comments and the statements that have been made, like unconditional surrender, things like that. But there is a reality of the history of war, and in this case, because it was laser, by defined as we will teach it, a limited war. This was not an unlimited war, which I have actually partaken of seizing an enemy's capital, taking what they value most, their centers of gravity, their power structure, their government, the rule of their population. That you can't do easily, but that's not what this war will go down in history. It was a limited war for these terms. We'll see whether those were met, and then we can start to make assessments of victory when it has actually entered this ending state. But this is the clarity that people want. That isn't the issue of war.
So Trump, the U.S. still has plenty of forces in the region. They also have the Marines and the airborne troops. Israel, of course, would be happy to go back to war. Do you think there's any chance that Trump says, "Well, I tried negotiations. I did really everything I could. I extended the deadline. We're going back to war." Or is that has that ship sailed?
No, if you, I mean, just look at this Trump administration. That is what he does. I'm not the person that's going to argue predicting the president's behavior or the administration. And again, I think people think like it's just him. Um, if you don't understand the United States national security apparatus, there are voices that he listens to more, but you in our decisions we have the national security advisor, the Department of State, your Treasury, everybody making these. Well, if this happens, here are the second, third order effects for us, which are unique. Every nation does this, right? This is what it means for us. But I think that is a very credible threat, and I agree, John Spencer personally, that take the president serious, but not literal. Take him seriously, but not literally. I do think he is both serious and literal. That if the negotiation doesn't go the way the United States could even allow it to go, that the use of continued military force is absolutely there, and beyond just what you mentioned, of course, the Marines, the 82nd. I mean, I flew from Italy, as a paratrooper to Iraq. It's a 5-hour flight. I If the United States wants to mobilize more than what is currently being discussed, it absolutely can. It is the only global projection power there is, and that's one of the many reasons that it's a superpower. I think he's serious, and I don't say it's likely. I think that it's the U.S. administration, like everybody should, wants an end to this war, but not on crazy terms, that which is the statements that you read by the Iran. Those are unlikely. I have more certainty that those terms that you read out are unlikely to be what the United States accepts, and it is very likely that if the United States doesn't, because it did that. I mean, the Witkoff and Kirshner negotiations before the start of the operation, I think were honest and good faith. I think the leadership at that moment, which doesn't exist anymore, was not negotiating in good faith. So the United States is going to try it again in this case. And if they aren't in good faith and just being ridiculous, I think it is very likely that continued military operations and all the list of things that the United States could do that it is talked about and of course debated on legality, which is insane as well, um, are on the table. There's so much on the table that it is a this is when you have military dominance. Of course, this is a limited war for certain political goals, but I think it's very likely, Laser. Yes.
And just final question, hopefully we can end on a even more positive note. What does it do when you have two militaries work as closely as Israel and the US have, both in planning this operation and in carrying it out? What does that mean for the ties between the militaries and the countries, indeed, looking 5, 10 years down the road?
Yeah. I mean, I think again, it validates the closeness of these two countries, the United States and Israel, over the years, the joint weapons development that has benefited both even the regional security closeness between the two, although both having separate interests. From a war perspective, it is not just political, but it is factual to say the United States has never had an ally in modern history that comes with that capability and willingness to go side by side, and that will have second and third order effects. One, it's a demonstration. Like war tests everything, Laser. I mean, it tastes. We sit and talk about how big and great other people are. Your China, Russia, Iran. War tests everything. This put the capabilities and relationship to the test, and was shown that all of the years of investment. I personally, John Spencer, again, and people say I'm biased, but I try to be literally as objective as possible. There are allies, of course. The as Churchill said, the worst. It's actually worse to be fighting with allies than fighting without them, right? So there is that aspect of political nature of of allies that have had historic relationships for a long time. I think those will continue. Those are important. For me, I think you need another term for Israel personally. I mean, there are allies, and then there are allies, as in with capability, right? Because then we can talk about Israel's investments in its national security and its ability, its capability becomes a resource, of for the good of many nations, and the United States together doing this operation, it will have political, military, economic, and information benefits for a long time. But it also came after years of military to military, industry to industry, and that will be advancing as well as we've talked about in the past. I mean, um, necessity is the mother of all innovation. There's a reason that Israel is like a skunk's works of military capabilities that nobody's ever seen before. One, because people are always trying to destroy Israel and they're not successful, which generates a different cultural way of thinking about threats and a different innovation cycle that has benefited. This is again the U.S. military talk, has benefited the U.S. military for decades. That Israel has paid in blood and treasure, but the benefits of a stronger military nation, region, even the United States military is, for me, very objective.
Excellent. So, John, we could talk for hours, and I'm sure we're going to do this again at some point, but I'm going to let you go. I know you have plenty to do. So, I just want to thank you for this conversation and we certainly will talk again.
Thank you, Laser, and please say hello to Amanda for me. I just listened to it before we got on. I'm a very avid listener to all the shows, actually.
Thank you. I will do. And thank you to all of you listeners out there in Israel and around the world. This has been the Laser Focus. I just want to thank Yitzhak Ledej for producing this episode and Ari Schlacht for editing. This has been the Laser Focus. Thank you and shalom.